Hi. So the Cinemas project is a photographic project that I started in 2006. Um, at the time, I was in between jobs, and I remember taking a workshop run by my friend David D'Souza, who was a photographer. And so this whole issue, the whole issue became, okay, what do I photograph? Because you have this entire city in front of you. And one of the days I was walking from Opera House to Ketwadi, and I stumbled into this single screen cinema just actually very close to Alfred, down Falkland Road, called Moti Talkies. And I ended up spending the next 3 days there. And to be very honest, at that time, I just had no clue what I was doing because I hadn't photographed that much before. So I sort of just, I started focusing on the everyday life, almost very banal things that went on in the cinema. And eventually I started looking around to see, what other people had done in terms of photographing cinema halls. And I found very little sort of long projects on these spaces. And most of the work that was there was very sort of was looking at them in a very sort of reified way, where they treated them as these grand old buildings, and oh, there's this entire narrative of loss that we're losing these spaces, and which is fine. I mean, I don't think we can deny that in any ways. But I decided to kind of focus on slightly more everyday aspects of the theater and what it meant to be in the theater, because those kind of narratives sort of it's sort of even though you can't separate completely from them, you probably want to look at something else. So the images are just gonna run, and actually, I mean, the images have their own narrative, and they do things to you that I won't be able to do justice to in some ways. But since I'm here, I'm gonna take liberties and maybe focus on the things that 4 years later, 3 years later, I kind of came away with after doing the project. So coming back to nostalgia, it became an issue for me because I needed to really think through it, and I didn't want it to be a nostalgic project, purely a nostalgic project. So I think the problem with nostalgia is that there's nothing wrong with it, but it sort of debilitates you, and it sort of limits your way of thinking in terms of imagining other possibilities of experience or other sort of everyday practices that take place. So in some ways you'd view these cinemas nostalgically, and you'll just sort of put them on this timeline. And you say, okay, now let's cast them off to history. And that's kind of unfair because a lot of these places are still running. In fact, every place I photographed was running. I made it a sort of a point not to shoot a cinema hall that is shut down. Not to say that some of these didn't shut down after I shot them. So it became a thing to try and think of history not as this straight line, which goes from, say, agrarian to industrial to post-industrial, or you have tradition, modernity, and you're always marching down this line, and then anything that sort of, or single screen to multiplex, anything that sort of doesn't neatly fit into this narrative of history that we've inherited seems completely anachronistic. It seems like it doesn't belong, or it seems like it's inefficient. So different way, and that occludes and kind of hides from us different ways of being or different ways of experiencing the world. That the more time I spent in the cinemas, I sort of started seeing that, and they were kind of unique in terms of the experience, not for me being there, which is obviously was unique, but for the people who go to the cinemas, which is very different from, I mean, on an obvious level, I mean, if you go to, say, the Palace Talkies, and someone who goes there and watches a Bhojpuri film and then, I don't know, has tea in the courtyard, or visits the nearby restaurant, is a very different cultural experience in some ways than a multiplex experience, right? Where it's way more surgical, where you're very cleanly and neatly guided from designer store in Inox to cinema to the food court, and then you're thrown out into the parking lot. So So I started looking at them and thinking about them more as experiences of space, which in some ways then it became a little more generative. I mean, I didn't mourn them in some ways, but I kind of saw possibilities that I wouldn't be able to see otherwise. Um, and so one of the ways I try to sort of uh, you have these the walls. I mean, like this, for example, the walls of these theaters are really thick with inscriptions and descriptions, and not to explain them away because you can't in some ways, but they kind of hint at both. Uh, uh, they hint at both the life of these buildings, the entire life of these buildings. At the same time, they hint at where they are right now. And so that's just a technique I used, which allowed me to separate myself from purely architectural, the wonders of of these spaces in that sense. Not to say that I didn't sort of include that as well. Um, which brings me back to sort of thinking about them as cultural experiences of space, where and then it becomes you notice very clearly how, for example, the actual physical layout, the design of these spaces, um, encourages a particular kind of experience. So New Royal would encourage, with a dargah, would encourage a very different kind of experience from another cinema. And you notice that each of these cinemas have their own unique kind of experiences, which are really produced in some ways by the very layout, the physicalities, the materialities of these spaces, which became really interesting to me. Um, and so the people not only just blindly are in the spaces they inhabit, but people sort of make things with these spaces, and you notice how then a very I don't know, a very sort of rational, ordered way of thinking about experience is extremely limiting. And in some ways, these cinemas for me, they kind of hinted at the absolute impossibility of that succeeding. And that's what I found was really interesting, because no matter how much you try to sort of, you have surveillance cameras and all that in a multiplex, but in the single screens, the very spaces kind of encouraged this kind of alternate little pockets of sociality, which I found really exciting. And which is something that, you maybe that if there's any nostalgia or there's any mourning, it perhaps is for those kind of experiences where when you want something to, when you always want to order it, and you have this very strict sort of managerial, I don't know, rationality where, this happens here and this is for this, you kind of lose that. And you realize in these spaces that it's not just to go to watch a film. It's many things. So, I mean, as simple as a projection room becomes at the same time a site of dwelling. It becomes a place of work. It becomes a place of, it becomes a shrine. And the cinema in general is not a place where we just go to watch films, but it's a place where sort of, it encourages a certain kind of escape, a certain kind of anonymity. And at the same time, with courtyards and benches, it encourages a certain kind of sociality, which we probably want to, that maybe is something to hold on to, if there's anything to hold on to. So that's all I'm going to say right now. So I don't think, I think it's going to go on for a couple of minutes more, and I'll just let the sort of image narrative take over now, and I'll stop my speaking. think that's the last one. So thanks a lot for having me.